In this video, we're going to talk about language proficiency testing. Language proficiency testing for students identified as English learners, or what the group that in Rhode Island we refer to as multilingual learners, has been required since the Elementary and Secondary Education Act in the 1960s. And this has been reauthorized over time in different forms through No Child Left Behind in 2001, and again through the Every Student Succeeds Act, ESSA, which was passed in 2015. So since the 1960s, we have been charged with making sure that schools and districts and states are regularly monitoring English learners' English language proficiency development over time to ensure that they're making adequate progress. As a result of this mandate, different assessments have emerged to help states and districts and schools do this work. The most dominant of which, by far, is the WIDA Access for ELLs assessment, often just called the Access Test. Although there are other organizations that offer language proficiency testing, like LastLinks and ELPA 21. Rhode Island uses WIDA, so we're going to focus in this video on the WIDA Access Test, but I want you to be aware of other ones that do exist. And some of these assessments, I think, do a better job of assessing non-English languages. So, for example, LastLinks has a Spanish language assessment that can be used to look at students' Spanish language development that many dual language and bilingual schools use around the country to not only measure students' English language development, but as the goal in those programs is bilingualism and biliteracy, also looking at how students are progressing in Spanish. Okay, so let's spend a little bit of time unpacking the WIDA Access Test. So what is the goal of the test? Why do we give it to English learners or to multilingual learners? So RIDE, the Rhode Island Department of Education, identifies the purpose in this way to assess the developing English language proficiency of English language learners in grades K through 12. And then this data is used. So again, one of the questions, remember, that we talked about in an earlier video is, what is it used for? What do we do with the information? So that this data is used to then determine the English language proficiency level of students, and ideally to inform classroom instruction and assessment, to aid in programmatic decision-making for students, and to provide data for meeting federal and state requirements with respect to student assessment. So a lot of purposes tied to this assessment. What does it actually measure? So again, an important question to ask of any assessment. So the Access Test is criterion referenced, which means that it's measuring kind of specific standards or specific items. And it's designed to measure students' social and academic proficiency in English associated with the arts, mathematics, science, and social studies, and across all domains of language: speaking, listening, reading, and writing. So you might remember when we talked about the WIDA standards that the standards are framed or kind of embedded in the content areas. So the language of science, the language of math, and in addition to social language. And so the WIDA Access Test looks at students' language use through this lens across the different content areas and different domains. And I want to take a moment to step back here and explain what criterion reference means. So standardized tests are often talked about in these two ways, as being norm referenced or criterion referenced. Norm reference means the student score is being compared to other student scores. So scores are represented in terms of a percentile. And the kind of goal is to see kind of what is normal. So there's like a line of, this is average, this is the normal score, and then everyone kind of falls above or below it. So SAT tests, GRE, IQ tests are norm reference. So it's not about the content itself and you're receiving your score based on that. You're being compared to other students, and that's how you receive your score. Criterion reference, on the other hand, is more focused on kind of the specific objective or standard. And then it's determined by tallying how many questions the student got correct. Typically, you're still not given the scores as a raw score. Sometimes you are, but then it's often converted into a percentage correct or you'll see with the WIDA access test that they use kind of a scale score, but it is still based not on how you're being compared to other students, but how you're performing based on the criteria of the test. So classroom tests usually use this. Most teachers don't grade on a curve and give somebody an A and somebody else an F based on comparing them to their peers. Most tests are criteria referenced, right? Where there's a set of criteria and you're evaluating students' ability to perform that criteria. The access test is like this as well. Okay, so this is an example of a student report. And if you are a practicing teacher and you work with MLLs, you likely have seen these. I just want to take a minute to kind of unpack some different pieces of what this report includes. So we can see here that it assesses all 4 language domains, as we looked at on the previous slide. So you see listening, speaking, reading, and writing. You also see some composite scores. Oral language, they combine listening and speaking. Literacy combines reading and writing, and comprehension combines reading and listening. So they give some of these composite scores as well. I mean, it's really important to see the range of where students are. Sometimes we talk about students' overall score and say the student, is at a 3.4. But that might obscure a lot of information, because if their listening is a 4, that means they're comprehending quite a bit. And if their speaking is a 2, that means they can continue to need some supports for speaking, but that shows me that they're understanding a lot, and that if I give them opportunities to show me what they know that might not require speaking, I might be able to see a lot more of what they can do. So looking really carefully at these individual language domain scores is really important as we think about supports. You can see this scale that I've been referencing. So kind of the stages of second language acquisition that we've talked about in this course, from level 1 to level 6, from entering to reaching. And so you see the proficiency level uses that scale. These levels are grade specific. So it's important to know that a 4 from a second grader and a 4 from an 8th grader does not represent the same amount of English language ability, because it is based on the grade. So just as an A on a math test for an 8th grader and an A on a math test for a second grader doesn't mean that they have the same mathematical knowledge. The proficiency level scores are the same here. So they're based on, for the grade level assessment, where are you in terms of grade level proficiency in English? So you can't compare those across grades. However, you can compare scale scores across grades. So you see to the right here, we have the scale score, and all students are placed on a single continuum, a single line from kindergarten to 12th grade, as they are taking this test over time, looking at their English language proficiency. So for a single student, you could look at how they performed in listening the year before, and look at how that scale score has changed. So that's a helpful thing to think about as you're looking at an individual student's progress over time. Scale scores are not raw scores. So it's not that they got 368 questions correct, if you look at that listening, because the way that the test works is that as students go through the test, how they perform on a question determines the next question they see. So if they get the question right, they might get a more challenging question. If they get the question wrong, they might get an easier question. So the test is designed so that the student is able to engage with it, but it does give them more difficult or easier questions depending on how they do. So that's why the number doesn't reflect a number correct, but it does reflect overall kind of performance on the assessment. All right, so now that you have kind of a basic sense for why we do the access test or a language proficiency test, what it looks like, we get the actual results. I want to talk a little bit about sharing this data, because it is important to think about how this information is then not only informing teachers' instruction, but communicated with parents or guardians. And by law, teachers and schools must share this information with families. But it's also important for that parents understand how to interpret these results, and that they know that this is just one measure of their child's language ability at this moment, right? So that they take that in stride. So a few questions that could come up, just to kind of give you some supports on how you might respond. One parent might say, how is this going to impact my child's grade? So really clarifying that a standardized assessment like this isn't impacting a child's grade. It's providing a snapshot of the child's learning to inform a teacher's instruction, and also to ensure that the school is complying with the federal mandate of regularly monitoring English learners in their classroom. As a parent might say, I know he knows English, he speaks it all the time. Why is his score so low? So emphasizing that this is, again, just one measure. Maybe he didn't have a good day. Maybe he was nervous. Maybe he didn't understand the directions or didn't read them. And also recognizing, as we've talked about with BICS and CALP, with conversational language and academic language, that just because a child can speak a language really well doesn't mean a child has mastered all of the academic language that they're still learning at school, and that they've mastered it in every domain. So maybe their reading and writing, they're still really developing, even if they can speak very proficiently. And that's where looking at the individual domains becomes really important, right? So you can see, yeah, his speaking is a 5, but his reading is still at a 2. So that's where he really needs support. And then finally, he needs accommodations. How can I make sure he's getting them? And so talking with parents about, yes, you need to, let's get some documentation on file about the accommodations that the student needs. And there are accommodations that some are built in with computer adaptive technology, but other accommodations can be made, like having students test in a separate room, giving students more time. But it's important to have that documented. And so making sure that a parent has gone through the process to get that documented if that's something the child needs. So I hope this is helpful, especially for those of you who might be brand new to thinking about language proficiency testing. And we'll dive a little bit more into this as we continue in this learning.